Hi everyone, I'm excited to start the next part of our module. One of my favorite quotes is by a fellow Texan, Gloria Anzalua, who says, "I changed myself, I changed the world." And this quote really highlights that any work we want to do on inclusivity has to start with ourselves. So with that being said, there's a handout on your screen. You should have also printed it, but if you don't have a printer, you can follow along. And on a separate sheet of paper, I would like for you to write down your answers. So I'm going to give you a minute, and without cheating and going to Google and typing in what you should answer, I would like for you to go in and answer every single box along the circle. Now, for example, when it comes to national origin, for example, I would put, born in the United States, or however you identify. You put how you identify in every single box. Now, if you don't know the answer, guess what? That's okay. The first time I did this, I didn't know how to answer 2 or 3 of these boxes. Leave them blank. We're going to go through the handout. It'll be much more beneficial for you to leave them blank as we talk about it than for you to go to pause this and go to Google. Because part of it is a conversation about maybe why we struggle to answer some of these. So again, I'm going to give you a minute or two to go through all the boxes. And in each box, put how you identify. Now, if you finish early and you have extra time, feel free to answer the 5 questions at the bottom. However, not necessary if you're still stuck on this, but that's what we're going to start with in the next part of the module. I'm going to give you a minute. Thank you for completing the handout. I'm really excited as we go through the next phase of our journey in the inclusivity learning modules. What I'd like to do now is go through a series of questions to have a dialogue as we unpack this handout. And when I mean dialogue, I mean mostly me talking and you listening. But in my head, we're having a conversation. The first question I would ask my students as we work through this module is, which box was hard? Which ones did you leave blank? For me, for example, when I did this activity over a decade ago, the boxes that were difficult were the disability ability box, the class box, and the national origin box. So for example, national origin. Well, I'm Mexican and Latina. I was born here in the United States. But because race, ethnicity, and national origin are many times used interchangeably, I really struggled about, well, what does each word mean? So when it came to answer the box, well, I am of Mexican descent, I was born here in the United States. And it's important to differentiate that, because even though we might have history or cultural backgrounds from different countries, where you're born definitely impacts your experience specifically in this country and in this state. And so national origin just really means where you're born. The other one I struggled with was class. I didn't know where I fell in the boundaries of working class, middle class, upper class. I didn't know the numbers. And so a lot of people who do this activity really struggle as, well, let me Google and see where I land on the income bracket. But that's not what we mean when we're doing this activity. What we want you to think about is, how do you feel? How do you engage in the world? So for example, if the majority of the world lives on $2 a day, Well, in comparison to developing countries, maybe I feel differently about class. However, what I put in my box is working class because I come from a working class background and I still live a very working class reality even though I'm an elected official. So the point of this is identity is not necessarily about the boxes that society tells you should be in, but the boxes you feel for yourself. And so as we continue through this activity, remember that this activity is about you, how you feel, and how you engage in the world. The third box is really personal, disability ability. I left this box blank when I first did it, which now as I reflect is surprising because I'm the oldest of 11. My youngest sister, Angelita, has Down syndrome. So I had had active conversations about disability in my household. For example, we all had to learn basic sign language, or we had to think differently about the future of our family because of my little sister. But even though she was an active presence in my life, I had never stopped to reflect about my own ability status. And I guess the question is why? Well, the truth of the matter is the world was made for me and not necessarily for people like my little sister. And so I never had to stop and question my own ability status because it was never even a thought throughout my day. I'll give an example. Before I got elected, I worked at a university, and my colleague was a woman in a wheelchair, and we had offices right next door to one another. And one day, we had happened to have been working all day that day, and in the middle of the day, the elevator broke. That same day, the fire alarm went off. And it was a reality check at that point that the world was set up for people who were able-bodied, and people who had a disability had a very different experience of the world because she was trapped on the third floor. So the reason I left my box blank was because I was never given the language to think about my privileged status as a person who is able-bodied. So in that box now, I put temporarily able-bodied. Why temporary? Well, because it could change. It could change at any moment. Something could happen in my life that changes my ability status. And just like all the boxes, ability or class or sexual orientation or gender identity, these boxes are fluid. And so a lot of times in society, we think, oh, this is the box, and I will always exist in this box. But the reality is the boxes can change. And if we start to think about the fluidity of identity, then it makes us think a little bit more open-mindedly about identity as a whole. So, as we unpack these, I hope to continue to make identity more complex, because I think one of the things that we have done is say, identity is in these boxes, and that's the only way it could be or should be. I think one of the goals of today is to think about why do those boxes exist, and how do we challenge the boxes while at the same time embracing the boxes to further promote diversity and representation. The second question I would ask my students as we work through the handout is, which box was easy? So naturally, the age box is usually the first one that people say, well, that's easy. I just put my age. And while that's not technically wrong, what we're talking about here is identity and groups and communities and power and privilege dynamic and who has a seat at the table and whose knowledge is more valued, right? So let's think about that. It's more than age. It's about which groups have access. So are you a young adult? Are you youth? Are you someone who identifies as elderly? Are you middle-aged? And so that really, are you a senior citizen? That changes your ability or your access to things. So for example, I was 26 when I became assistant dean at a university. And I remember as I sat at my first dean meeting and how everybody was a couple of decades older than me, feeling and experiencing like my voice was not as equally valued at the table, probably as well because of my other identities of, being a woman or a woman of color, but also, and I could feel it, age. It was the first time that I had ever really thought about ageism. Simultaneously, while I love my dad and he's my best friend, even if he is a Republican, one of the conversations we would have when my grandfather was still alive is like, oh, mija, don't listen to your granddad. He's so old, he doesn't know what he's talking about. But my grandfather was 99 years old, full of knowledge and information that we should have access to. But when my dad, and even though my dad loved my grandfather, The reality is in society, younger voices and elder voices are a lot of times pushed aside or not equally valued. So as we think about identity and we think about who's at the table in regards to our party, in what ways are we proactively resisting the forces that tell us that only certain voices matter? How are we asking the questions of who's at the table and who's not? Whose voices are we listening to? And how do we bring a multi-generational movement to our local and statewide party? Because the truth of the matter is none of this is going to work without a multi-generational movement. But that has to be done with intentionality. So age is more than just a number. It really is about an experience with identity. And so that's important for us to think about as we do this inclusivity work. The second identity that I thought was easy was first language. I grew up bilingual, speaking both English and Spanish. And so it never really dawned on me that first language would really be an identity marker. But what I realized, specifically through my work in academia, is that if you have an accent in this country, you're treated differently. And therefore, my first language being English provided me with a lot of different privileges that maybe people who weren't born and have an accent don't experience. And so it's important, again, asking the tough questions. In what ways am I making some people feel welcome and other people not feel welcome? And the third that was easy was gender identity. So I'm going to unpack that a little bit more. Follow me to this little giant post-its because I love giant post-its. When I first did this activity, the third box that I thought was easy was gender identity, mostly because I had not become aware of this gender spectrum. So I initially thought man, woman could go in the gender box. But as we know, and as we are continuing to gain awareness on, is that gender is more of a spectrum. I mean, you could put everything from man, woman, trans man, trans woman, transgender, to agender, bigender, genderqueer, gender nonconforming. And the point of the matter is that even though there's lists could have, because in the United States there are 76 recognized different gender communities and growing, that this list can be more extensive. The point of the matter is first, that gender and all identities are more complex than we really understand, and that our job is to make a seat at the table for everybody. But if we don't start to gain awareness about the complexity of identity or the diversity of gender and other identities, then how do we make that seat available without that recognition? So my point of this again is that this list is more complex and it's more expansive, and it is our job to continue our learning till we can make a seat at the table. Because if we don't have an understanding, how do we make that seat available for everybody? I think it's also really important to point out that there is a difference between gender identity and sexual orientation. These are two different things we're talking about. And while they intersect and inform each other, they're in two different identity groups that a lot of times get conflated together for a reason, but it's really important for us to understand that.